I want to thank you for the invitation to participate in the 24th International Research to Practice Conference, Young Musicologists. My name is Anna Danida. I'm a Dalcroze's eurythmics teacher, choreographer, and dance theoretician. Currently, under the supervision of Professor Małgorzata Janicka-Słysz, I'm working on solo movement reinterpretations of music in the light of Émil Jaques-Dalcroze's eurythmics. This presentation is an attempt to describe a general approach to the complex relationship between music and movement. The main inspiration for drawing out issues relating to this particular problem was the theoretical reflections of Witold Lutosławski. The composer noted that, quote, "the rhythm and expression of the acts taking place on stage should not reflect those of the music. The close relationship between music and dance should sometimes consist in a contrast, but often also in a specific counterpoint in which the gestures and actions on stage enter into a dialogue with the progression of the music, thus forming an inseparable composition." End quote. In 2013, a collection of reflections by Polish dance artists on the role of classical music in their artistic activity was compiled. Jacek Dyski, Mikołaj Mikołajczyk, Tomasz Rodowicz, and Bożena Elterman have found common ground in their shared view of music as the foundation on which artistic expression is built. In their view, music is inspiring, constructs images, and becomes the starting point for physical movement activities, and it's mobilizing for the artists. Ewa Wycichowska, Anna Wańtuch, and Włodzimierz Kaczkowski presented a different perspective. They believe that music doesn't necessarily form the foundation for artistic creation. The artists stated that the concept or theme of the performance determined the choice of musical repertoire. Please pay attention Włodzimierz Kaczkowski's excerpted statement about the role of classical music in the work of the Zawirowania Dance Theatre.
Raczej opieramy się na muzyce elektronicznej. Znaczy po pierwsze, że to jest bardzo dobrze wiąże się z ruchem, z rytmem, a poza tym też taka muzyka, która jest jakby aktualna w jakiś sposób ułatwia nam kontakt z młodzieżową widownią. Natomiast jednocześnie stworzyliśmy spektakl, który był oparty na Chopinie, na muzyce Chopina i oczywiście wtedy jakby po raz pierwszy zderzyliśmy z tym, co można określić przyzwyczajenia słuchacza, widza do odbioru tego typu muzyki. Znaczy nagle się okazuje, że ta muzyka kojarzy się z pewnymi obrazami i trzeba coś z tym zrobić, to znaczy albo je zaakceptować, o to trudną sytuację, kiedy zespół jest zupełnie oparty na innych doświadczeniach ruchowych, albo z nimi zerwać. No i właściwie rzeczywiście większość pracy podczas tego spektaklu polegała na jakby zerwaniu, znaczy próbie zerwaniu takiego schematu odbioru Chopina.
Zapewne każdy choreograf ma swoją własną metodę opracowywania muzyki. Ja osobiście staram się ją jak najlepiej poznać. Posiłkuję się również zapisem nutowym, partyturami. Jest to dla mnie bardzo, bardzo pomocne. Za każdym razem, kiedy zamierzam opracować choreografię do jakiegoś utworu, zawsze dogłębnie analizuję muzykę po to, żeby poznać ją jak najlepiej. Po to właśnie, żeby w idealny sposób zespolić tą muzykę z ruchem tancerzy.
The reflections of the aforementioned Polish artist inspired me to try to define and interpret the relationship between music and movement in 4 variants: autonomous, contrasting, dialogue, and closely related. I am aware that the perspective proposed here only offers a preliminary insight into the issue at stake and an invitation to go deeper. I also believe that such a focused exploration will yield significant insight both the work and its creator. Music and movement autonomy are discussed from 2 perspectives: integration of independent entities and musical quasi-duality. The basis of the first creative situation is to perform autonomous musical choreographic and visual actions within a single work of art. This principle can be clearly seen in the example of the composer-choreographer's duo, Cage-Cunningham. This artist declared formal independence of movement from music and scenography. According to this assumption, the process of composing choreography and music proceeded simultaneously within the creative independence that connected them. Music existed as an autonomous entity, and movement was also such an autonomous being. Only during the performance did their integration occur. I would now like to present a selected fragment from the ballet Un jour en deux by Cunningham to the piece Etc. by John Cage. The second instance of music and movement autonomy, here defined as musical quasi-duality, refers to the simultaneous use of two pieces of music for dance. An artist improvises or performs a fixed spatial and movement routine while listening to music through headphones. This is a different piece of music to the one presented to the audience. A stage performance of this kind took place, for example, during an examination of choreographic solitudes at the Fryderyk Chopin University of Music in Warsaw in 2019. Aleksandra Kilczewska performed a choreographed piece entitled Orlando to a Lindy musical composition, while the audience listened to Agata Zubel's Parlando for a voice and computer. In this case, one of the pieces of music was deliberately annulled. The artist intentionally excluded herself from the music that was intended for the audience. The audience, in turn, had no access to the music that was listened to by a performer. Another recognized creative situation is contrast, which I understand as the intentional opposition of music to movement or vice versa. Analytical interpretative actions are undertaken from the perspective of one of these artistic fields. The contrasting relationship, therefore, makes it necessary to establish a hierarchy. The final form of an artistic expression should not reveal this priority, but rather convey an impression of the audio-visual complementarity of the arts, their creative correspondence. This relationship is, in other words, a logical and coherent structure that is internally dialectical. I would now like to present a fragment of the dance Parrucca, performed by Antonio Gades in 1969. The dancer utilized a sustained, light, and upward-directed quality of movement in opposition to the character of the rhythm and articulation employed. Contrast can also be perceived as magnification versus fading, passage versus stasis, collision versus dissolution, speed versus freezing, or exaltation versus composure. At its foundation lies the suggestion of expression, structure, and content versus the form of the artwork. The music movement situation thus described is characterized by a so-called feedback effect, as the creator is inspired by the music, but doesn't depict it in the movement, instead emphasizing selected differences. In this way, the movement complements the music and the music complements the movement. However, maintaining symmetry between other elements of the artistic fields, for example, the formal structure of the works or their duration, is very important. I would like to draw attention at this point to the convergence of views regarding the relationship of contrast. Anya Peterson-Roy stated that, quote, artistry in music, dance, and theater is defined by the level of interest that a performance evokes. This interest is partially related to balance and contrast, end quote. Meanwhile, Émil Jaques-Dalcroze, writing about stillness and silence, noted that, quote, every action needs a contrasting element that highlights its value. Furthermore, quote, while maintaining order in the means of expressions is important, the order itself doesn't constitute value. Regularity occasionally requires variation in the form of contrasts in duration, dynamism, and space. Lines do not have to be beautiful, they must be balanced. When there is a proper selection of proportions of the material used, leading to contrasts, the work evokes personal emotions in us. End quote. Royce's and Dalcroze's reflections encapsulate what I would like to articulate. Balance often arises from the breaking of symmetry. In the context of the considerations developed here, dialogue can be defined as an exchange of thoughts through movement and the art of sounds. The body and instrument convey motifs, phrases, and sentences to each other, referring to the partner's expression, commenting on it, processing it. Dialogue is the fluidity of boundaries between movement and sounds and the possibility of one art penetrating another. Drawing inspiration from selected elements of the analysis of strict forms of polyphony, I distinguished between contrast and constant and variable aspects of dialogue. Constant dialogue involves the use of the same spatial movement formation each time of the motif, phrase, and musical sentence is repeated. One can note this type of relationship in Isadora Duncan's free dance. Variable dialogue is characterized by the introduction of a new spatial movement formation to the same motif, phrase, or musical sentence. An example of this creative strategy can be found in a fragment of Max Eck's choreography Smoke to Arvo Pärt's piece Spiegel im Spiegel. The dancer responds to selected moments in the piano or violin parts. when discussing the relationship between music and movement, I would like to refer to the thoughts of Émil Jaques-Dalcroze, who claimed that, quote, "The issue is not to reveal all the details of musical rhythm in a movement interpretation," end quote. Please note the injunction of Witold Lutosławski, who opposed reducing the role of a musical work to the function of accompaniment and the bodily materialization of the score. Starting from these statements, I conclude that questioning the literal reflection of music in movement could have been a concern for musicians anxious about the effect ironically termed Mickey Mousing. The highlighted concept was borrowed from film art and refers to the complete synchronizations of action with music, which can be perceived as a joke. Allow me to present a short excerpt from Walt Disney's Fantasia and one piece from the ballet Coppelia, which are the most striking examples of this music and movement relationship. For this reason, Émil Jaques-Dalcroze emphasized that, quote, "Art must be expressive by its very nature and by its power, not imitative and impressionistic," end quote. It is therefore essential to attempt to read the composer's intention and present the essence of the musical work in choreographic and theatrical terms. Let us take one pertinent example, an excerpt from the movement interpretation of Bach's E major Fugue No. 2 by Clara Schumann. Barbara Turska wrote about movement interpretations of works in this way. Music is blind, movement is mute. By creating a musical movement whole, we simultaneously influence the senses of sight and hearing. As a result, music becomes somewhat visible and movement somewhat audible, end quote. However, I have the impression that analyzing and interpreting the relationship between music and movement in the four situations presented here, autonomy, contrast, dialogue, and dependency, two distinct perspectives and artistic needs emerge. In the contrasted, dialogical, and closely dependent relationship, the first and main area from which inspiration flows is the musical work. It becomes the formal and artistic foundation of the stage piece. In the context of the entirety of dance and choreographic art, it can be noted that the movement layer, along with its content and emotional values, can be accompanied by a musical work, but it's not a necessary condition for the choreographic work to be established. The choreographer can initiate the creative process based on an idea, intellectual reflection, emotional experience, or intention. Thank you very much for your attention and for inviting me to participate in the seminar. I hope that the relationship between music and movement that I have highlighted and characterized will open the possibility of it for a joint discussion. I am very curious about all comments and opinions. Thank you very much.